By 50 BC, Julius Caesar had largely pacified Gaul, modern-day France. 8 years of war, enslavement, and destruction had gradually crushed the Gauls as Caesar won victory after victory. Total control seemed inevitable until in 52 BC, during the Battle of Gergovia, Caesar suffered a defeat at the hands of the Gallic rebel Vercingetorix. For 2 more years, Caesar pursued the charismatic rebel with his army of 80,000, until he pinned Vercingetorix inside the town of Alesia. Months went by as the Gallic army slowly starved inside the town. However, much to the surprise of Caesar, Vercingetorix was not alone, and an army of 200,000 Gauls soon surrounded Caesar's fortifications. Caesar's veteran legions held their ground, but the force of numbers soon proved too much. Defeat seemed inevitable until Caesar sprang his trap and drove his cavalry into the rear of the Gauls. Vercingetorix's army was annihilated, and Caesar had finally conquered the whole of Gaul. However, back in Rome, the Senate was becoming more and more aggravated with Caesar. He was immensely popular with the people, and had a veteran army of 40,000 at his fingertips. And with poverty and corruption reeking throughout the empire, reform started to become inevitable. Not but 50 years earlier, the 2 generals Marius and Sulla had plunged the Republic into civil war, nearly destroying it. The Senate was not about to repeat this same history under Caesar. Led by Marcus Cato and the nobility, the Senate attempted to prosecute Caesar after January of 49 BC, when his governorship of Gaul expired. Caesar quickly crossed the Alps with a single legion into the city of Ravenna, hoping to gain better leverage against the Senate. Either to Caesar's joy or his dismay, the Senate vigorously declared him an enemy of the state, calling on Caesar's old friend Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, to lift up the sword against him. Caesar, now claiming his hand forced, gathered his 13th legion and marched on Rome. Though a famous general, most of Pompey's forces lay scattered throughout the empire, and he was only able to assemble an army of 15,000 men to defend the city. Though Caesar had only 4,000 in contrast, his men were veteran fighters from Gaul. Pompey's men were raw recruits. There was no doubt who would win in a pitched fight. Knowing this, Caesar plowed through Italy as fast as possible, and within days his army was only miles from the city. Pompey, knowing what little chance he had, took his troops and every citizen that he could and evacuated Rome. Those who did not leave were considered enemies of the state, much different than Caesar's policies of appeasement. With Rome abandoned and Pompey's forces fleeing to Greece, Caesar took the vacant city and the whole of Italy as his own. But time cannot be wasted. Pompey was gathering his forces in mainland Greece and assembling an army ready to attack Caesar. Knowing he had to be fast, Caesar marched west into Spain, where several legions loyal to Pompey were garrisoned. However, they were commanded by mere lieutenants. In only 27 days, Caesar reached the Pompeian forces in Spain, gathering several of his Gallic legions as he marched. For weeks, the armies maneuvered around each other until Caesar ultimately came out on top, forcing the enemy to surrender and join him. Though northern and southern Spain had fallen easily, Caesar now had to take on the Pompeian forces in the rest of the empire. Caesar gathered his forces at the heels of Italy and prepared to sail across the Adriatic to confront Pompey in Greece. The only problem was that Pompey had blockaded the Adriatic with his far superior fleet, leaving Caesar in a desperate situation. Caesar was only able to sneak by with a small force, and even after his comrades came to resupply him, his army was only 20,000 strong. Pompey and Caesar maneuvered and skirmished until clashing with each other at Dyrrhachium. Caesar was badly defeated, losing over 1,000 of his veteran soldiers in retreat. However, he was not finished, and maneuvered to the fields of Pharsalus for a final stand with Pompey. Though Pompey was reluctant to attack Caesar, the Senate forced his hand into the move, and on the 9th of August, 48 BC, the 2 armies finally clashed near the hills of Pharsalus. Pompey maneuvered his forces to the top of a large hill, expecting his numerical superiority of almost 2 to 1 to crush Caesar's army. However, Caesar still advanced, and charged his front lines forward. Both forces held firm, Caesar's veterans versus Pompey's immense army. Pompey intended to end the fight, and sent his cavalry into Caesar's right flank. However, Caesar had foreseen this move, and had hidden a large group of heavy legionaries near his right. Pompey's cavalry were completely surprised and annihilated by Caesar's troops. They retreated, running across Pompey's front lines, with Caesar's infantry in close pursuit. Within minutes, Pompey's entire army had panicked and fled. Pompey was crushed by his defeat and quickly fled to Egypt alone. He expected to find friends in safety there. Rather, he was murdered by the leaders of the Ptolemy dynasty. When Caesar arrived in Egypt, he was disgusted and quickly set about reorganizing the area using his influence. At the time, there was civil war between the two young rulers and siblings, and even spouses, Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII. Caesar found Cleopatra and reinstated her on the throne. Ptolemy, however, was found dead in the Nile. Caesar spent 9 more months in Egypt, securing relations with a valuable ally, and had his first legitimate son with the Queen Cleopatra. However, in Africa, the remaining Senate forces, led by the general Scipio, were amassed and ready once again to fight Caesar. After marching through Syria and Pontus, easily crushing the local kings, Caesar turned his attention to the last remaining threat. He marched around the Mediterranean, gathering and reassuring his legions that this was the last push and that it was all that was necessary to give peace and stability back to the Roman Empire. The armies met near Thapsus, Scipio slightly outnumbering Caesar and possessing the tanks of the ancient world, elephants. Caesar planned cautiously. However, his trumpeter signaled the attack without orders and far too early. His archers opened fire and his front lines moved up. However, Scipio's army, instead of holding their ground, panicked. Caesar immediately sent in the rest of his forces, causing Scipio's elephants to run amok and charge their own men. The entire army was routed within minutes. It was one of the shortest battles in all of history. After Thapsus, Caesar was supreme. He had won every major battle over the course of the war. He'd beaten back almost impossible numbers and odds. He had transformed the Republic of Rome into an autocratic state, and it was now time to use that power. Caesar returned to Rome and set about reforming his new empire. He passed laws reforming and limiting the number of slaves one could use for employment. He pumped the first breaths of life into the dying Roman economy and ridded Rome of the dominance the old corrupt patrician order had. Though the common people loved him for these things, the nobility, watching their 700-year grasp of power slowly fade away, hated Caesar. And on the Ides of March, after months of conspiring and planning, Marcus Brutus, the man who Caesar considered his son and second in his will, took up the sword with Gaius Cassius and the rest of the Senate, and killed Gaius Julius Caesar.